All right, billions of taxpayer dollars have been earmarked for new housing initiatives announced by the Prime Minister.
If we want to build more homes faster, we also need to be upgrading critical infrastructure, including water and wastewater infrastructure. To do exactly that, we'll launch the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund with $1 billion available to be allocated in the short term for municipalities to support needs that will directly create more housing, and $5 billion for agreements with provinces and territories to support investments in long-term priorities.
Okay, so that announcement happened just not long ago. So I want to bring in our Parliament Hill correspondent, Glen McGregor, who is standing by for us live right now in Ottawa for reaction to a number of things, Glen. But first, let's begin with this announcement. That is a big chunk of change that we're talking here for housing.
It sure is a big dollar announcement to address what is really kind of the Liberal government's biggest problem right now, is the inability to get affordable housing and just generally housing built in this country and do it quickly. So they're throwing lots of money at it. The federal budget, which is going to be announced later this month, is going to contain $6 billion for infrastructure. So this is for things like water mains, sewage mains that you need to build in municipalities in order to build more houses. And this is a big drain on municipal budgets as well. So the government is proposing, first of all, $1 billion right up front, kind of on an emergency basis, to get that money into municipalities so they can approve new housing projects. Then there's another $5 billion, which is going to come through deals that the federal government is going to negotiate with each of the provinces, and they have to do it quickly because it's going to time out at the end of the year. So he wants to move this money very quickly, but it's also coming with some strings attached. And one of them is really aimed at Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who recently made headlines for saying that he wasn't really in favor of building things like fourplexes. He wants to focus more on single home dwellings, townhomes, those kinds of things you find more often in the suburbs. The federal government says, no, you've got to ensure that you're building to help people who can't maybe afford a single home, but could afford a unit in a fourplex or in a triplex or in a duplex. So that's one of the conditions of this agreement. There's also the condition that for provinces to be able to accept this money, they have to agree to terms involving public transit. They have to essentially waive the minimum parking requirements for homes that, and we're talking mainly about condominiums here, that are built within 800 meters of high-speed transit. So if you had, of course, a subway station or a light rail station, that would mean that if you were going to approve the development, you couldn't require the builder to insist on having parking spaces there. Also the same provision applying to new condominium and apartments that are built near colleges or universities. So these things are going to be controversial for some provinces, but the federal government is saying, okay, if you want to do it, you want to take the money, you're going to have to meet these terms. That last condition about the transit stations, that was actually something that Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party leader, proposed a few months ago and campaigned on it. The federal government obviously thinks it's a pretty good idea. But the big question now, though, is all this money that they're going to spend on this, where is it going to come from? How deeply into the red is the federal government going to go when that budget's announced on April 16th, Mel?
Yes, just a couple weeks' time from there. You say strings attached. I see it more as very heavy ropes, because we have seen what has happened when the feds announce whatever it is, but we need the cooperation of the provinces to do X, Y, and Z. This does not happen overnight. It does not happen without some sort of backlash. We actually heard just moments ago from Ontario Premier Ford saying, listen, he's not going to be there come election time. Speaking about the carbon tax, of course, the pushback, which we continue to see, which came into play as of yesterday. This tour of announcements, Glen, I mean, obviously they're giving little tidbits of the budget, which are coming up. But are people really paying attention to these announcements, or are they looking like sort of these last-ditch efforts where we promised we were going to do this, we have to do this, we have to keep our word? You know, what does this mean optically?
Yeah, some of them have been previously promised, like the announcement we talked about yesterday about the school food program that the government is launching, $1 billion program over 5 years to help kids, lower-income children, mostly who can't afford, who show up at school without proper breakfasts or lunches. The Liberals have been talking about that since the 2021 election campaign. Now they're finally doing it. This announcement, though, I think is part of the pattern of these pre-budget announcements the government has made over the past weeks. They're almost in kind of campaign mode, really. It feels very much like an election campaign because the Prime Minister has an event every day, announces a major program every day, and then goes on to the next one. I think the thinking is strategically is when the budget comes out, it's going to kind of get overshadowed by what will be the top line number, and that is usually how deeply in deficit the federal government is, and then all the other things become details. This way, by announcing them in advance, every day, a new announcement, they can kind of get more bang for the buck. Here we are talking about the $6 billion they're going to spend on housing. People are going to notice that, whereas if it was all announced, meld together at the same time on budget day, might not get the same attention.
Very good. Glenn, lastly for you, we were watching that news conference as we were here in the newsroom, overpowered by protesters. And this is not new. We've seen it anywhere that Trudeau and his government travels. People are very outspoken.
Right.
You know, putting yourself in the mindset of the Prime Minister, how do you try to block that or try to temper that with trying to make this big announcement, but you know that people are not necessarily listening to a word you're saying?
That's right. So the drumming you heard in the background of that announcement, that was by Indigenous groups down in Nova Scotia who are concerned more like kind of a local issue. There was a conflict between the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Mi'kmaq fishermen in Nova Scotia, and the local groups were unhappy with that, so they're coming out to protest that. But you're right. Everywhere Trudeau goes, he seems to attract very angry crowds. This is something we've seen since the 2021 election campaign. I was on the Liberal campaign bus through much of that campaign, and the crowds were really angry, very animated, caused a lot of problems for the Prime Minister's security detail. And at one event in Bolton, Ontario, the crowd was so rambunctious and angry, and the way the venue was set up was very difficult for them to protect the Prime Minister, so they canceled the event altogether. This is going to be something we're going to see, and it's picked up since the 2022 Freedom Convoy movement here in Ottawa and as well in Windsor and other places, that we're seeing these very agitated groups who are not shy about coming out and expressing their displeasure at the Prime Minister's events. It's something we're going to watch as we head towards the next election campaign, whenever that is. It's going to be some real challenges for the security for the Prime Minister and for other leaders as well.
No doubt. All right, Parliament Hill correspondent Glen McGregor, appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly.